The commander of the Sri Lankan Army, Lieutenant General Sinanayake, Zambia Army Commander, Lieutenant General Komihova, senior officers from the Sri Lankan Army, Navy and Air Force, senior officers from various defense forces, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I'm Colonel M. Chiluba from the Zambia Air Force. This afternoon, Mr. Dan Kamel and I will represent RUCT in giving a presentation on the use of fourth generation warfare to counter violent extremism. May I ask them to mention that this presentation is non-classified and will take about 20 minutes. Introduction. Fighting or countering violent extremism has been there since time immemorial. It is worth noting that the fourth generation warfare theory was developed by an American, William S. Lind, alongside a team of United States analysts when they authored the Marine Corps Gazette in October 1989, titled The Changing Face of War into the Fourth Generation. Fourth generation warfare is asymmetric warfare. It is war between belligerents whose relative military power differs significantly, or whose strategy or tactics differ significantly. This is typically a war between a standing professional army and an insurgency or resistance movement. M. The aim for our presentation is to discuss how the fourth generation warfare may be employed to counter violent extremism. And to achieve this aim, the presentation will discuss the following. We'll look at the definitions of the generations of warfare, that is the first generation, the second, the third, and we'll put emphasis on the fourth generation of warfare. Then we'll look at the employment of fourth generation warfare to achieve counter violent extremism. Then we'll look at the UN plan of action to prevent violent extremism. Then we'll look at the use of fourth generation warfare to implement the UN plan of action. Then we shall conclude and invite the seminar participants to discuss, make observations and clarifications. The definitions. The first generation of warfare involved war of line and column tactics, where battles were formal and the battlefield was orderly. It ran roughly between 1648 and 1860. Most of the things that distinguish military from civilian uniforms, the saluting, that is a norm in the military, the careful gradations in terms of rank, were products of the first generation. The second generation of warfare was one answer to the contradiction between the culture of order and the military environment. The second generation war came as a great relief to soldiers, or at least their officers, because it preserved the culture of order, and the focus was inward on rules, processes, and procedures. The third generation of warfare, also a product of World War I, was developed by the German army and is commonly known as Blitzkrieg, or maneuver warfare. And this warfare Tactically, in the attack, a third-generation military seeks to get into the enemy's areas and collapsing from the rear forward. Instead of close with and destroy, the motto is bypass and collapse. And in the defense, it attempts to draw the enemy in, then cut him off. War ceases to be a shoving contest where forces attempt to hold or advance in line. The third generation of warfare was non-linear. Let me now focus on the fourth generation of warfare. The fourth generation of warfare marks the most radical change since the state militaries find themselves fighting non-state opponents. The fourth generation warfare has much in common with traditional low-intensity conflict in its classical forms of insurgency and guerrilla warfare. As in those small wars, the conflict is initiated by the weaker party through actions which can be termed as offensive. Fourth generation warfare opponents will not sign up to the Geneva Conventions, but some might open to a chivalric code governing how war with them would be fought. The fourth generation warfare has the following characteristics, which is lack of hierarchical authority, lack of formal structure, patience and flexibility, ability to keep a low profile when needed, and generally smaller in size. Now look at the employment of fourth generation warfare to counter violent extremism, which is the main task of discussion. In fourth generation warfare, state militaries have fought non-state opponents such as Al-Qaeda, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia or FARC, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil, Ilam, the LTTEs, to mention but a few. And primarily, the tenets of fourth generation warfare are political, economic, military, and social. I'll now invite Mr. Dan Camel to continue with the presentations.
Thank you. I can say that the Lavender Room, we had a quite dynamic afternoon preparing this topic. When we got the topic, we decided that we will divide it into three sections. The first one, which was just introduced, is the actual definition of what is the fourth generation counting violent extremism, or as we put it in acronym, CVE. The second part that we approached is the implementations on today's reality. Is it indeed in the current days in our reality, the fourth generation? Because as was mentioned, this is something that it's not new, but the portion of it relatively to today's reality is much more significant. And the third section is how does it apply on today's definition and doctrine, and if it is still valid, the doctrine that we have. So as we mentioned about what is the fourth generation, we isolated the following things as what defined them, the fourth generation. We can see they are long-term complex. They include terrorism. They include non-national or transnational base, highly decentralized. A direct attack on enemy's culture. All available pressures are used in that means, because we are talking about a non. It occurs in a low intensity conflict. This slide, we saw it yesterday in one of the presentations. This is the UN plan of action to prevent VE. And we took actually this slide and we asked ourselves, does the current doctrine, this one, valid relatively to the new threat? The dimensions, if we try to analyze solution, is that many of the methods that we see in the fourth generation warfare, they are not new. The percentage of the mixture inside that bottom line is just shifted. So for instance, on the global level, we can detect modern technologies and economic integration into global operations. Pervasive, the decline to nation-state warfare has forced all open conflict into the fourth-generation model. Granularity, mentioned. Vulnerability, open societies and economics. Technologies. One of the main things of the fourth generation is that the use of new technology is being used, and as the modern world moves forward, so does the non-state actors and the VC. The media. Today with the new, and it goes back to the technology. Every phone holder today is a journalist. And of course network. It's much easier for the groups to learn from one another and to adapt themselves to the new reality. The methodology that we chose to discuss in our group, we divided it into fourth generation warfare, the action that needs to be done, and this is just our suggestion, and how to use the fourth generation warfare on counter-violent extremism. So I will drill down into each and one of those topics written there. The fourth generation drivers, we can see the loss of nation states and the monopoly of violence. We can see the rise of culture, ethnic groups and religion conflicts. And we see the globalization via technological integration. We also see rare area operations, non-confronting nation states. We see the psychological, and we see the ad hoc innovation. Now, how do we see the effort in order to win the fourth GW conflict? One of the things that we see is like any other GW group, they are mostly, the majority of them are driven by funds. So allocate the main resource of funds, and it will be one of the main things to cut out the threat. We also put here menace attack threats undermine the treating basic human survival instincts, mistrust, uncertainty, on the national level plan, we discussed stop political backing through international platform or in organizations. And when mentioned before, all hands on deck, this is one of the things that is the implementation of that sentence. Monetary and logistic support to VE needs to be cancelized. That's what I just mentioned before. Funds must be allocated and the flow of funds must be cut off. People awareness through media, publishing campaign. Publishing campaign is using some of their own methods. So fight back with what they're fighting. Carrot and stick policy. International treaty. And sanctions of countries against extremism. In conclusion, taking under consideration the time limit that we had, and this is topic that we think should be learned and addressed and accordingly implemented. We actually leave the floor with a question mark, because in order to finalize, in order to reach some sort of conclusion, we also need the academia with us, other participants, in order to see the whole. So with that, I would like to say thank you.